Welcome to the podcast series on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings. I am your host, Liloba Paul, UNHCR Senior Learning Development Officer on topics related to gender-based violence. This work is brought to you by the Safe from the Start project, a collaboration between UNHCR's Division of International Protection and the Global Learning and Development Center in Budapest. Our topic today is GBV risk mitigation in emergencies. It is my pleasure to have with me June Munala, Senior GBV Officer based in Nairobi, Kenya at the Regional Bureau. She has recently been deployed to Slovakia as part of UNHCR's GBV emergency response to the Ukraine situation. Welcome, June.
Thank you, Lilova. Glad to be here.
Well, this is not the first emergency that you've been deployed to. Could you share with us a bit about what it was like being deployed as a senior GBV officer to this emergency? And maybe how was it different from other emergencies? Could you give us a little bit of context?
Yes, I will. You are right when you say that this is not the first emergency that I've been deployed to, but it is the first that I have been deployed to in Europe. And surprisingly, it is also the same for UNHCR. So everything was quite unique and different. And I'd just like to highlight one or two things that I found quite striking when I landed there. One, UNHCR had very little staff presence in Slovakia. So basically, we were like starting from scratch, like setting ourselves up, getting capacity in terms of UNHCR presence, and just getting to understand who are the people that we need to work with. Of course, the government taking full charge. And then secondly, one thing that I also found very striking in this emergency was that the capacity of the national response from the government, as well as civil society and other partners who had volunteered, was quite weak. So that meant there was need to immediately start identifying who are the different groups that you have to build their capacity to quickly take over the work that needs to happen. And then also, UNHCR was not very well known in that location. So you can imagine we're starting there, trying to make them understand that UNHCR, this is our mandate, although we had been there and we really reduced our presence in 2018, but the focus had largely been resettlement related and also a lot of advocacy work that the operation had undertaken. So this was totally new, totally different, and quite exciting for me.
Yes, and I had a few interactions with your other colleagues that were also deployed to the Ukraine situation in other country operations, and it was unique for them as well. And when did you first arrive in Slovakia, and how did you decide where you needed to go next in the country?
So I got into Slovakia on the 30th of March, but that was 2 days before I arrived through Hungary, because that was where I was initially deployed to. But I think the operation quickly looked at where the needs were huge and decided that we need to get into Slovakia immediately because we already had started building a presence in Hungary. So there I was into Slovakia, and the first place I landed was actually at the border points. So I went into the border locations to see and assess the capacity, the reception conditions, to see what was happening, to get a better sense of the numbers that were coming in, the profile of the refugees, just get a better understanding of the issues. And then after over 5 weeks there, I moved to the capital where there were also huge presence of other partners just to also tie it up with the national response where everything was also centralized and be able to kind of just tie everything up in terms of how we can build a more solid response in our GBV risk mitigation and prevention response work.
Yes, and before deploying to the situation, what were some of your top priorities to address GBV? And did any of those change once you were on the ground? And specifically, we're talking about GBV risk mitigation in this podcast, but I know your work went beyond that.
I would say for me, there were actually three. One, I wanted to understand the needs, risks, and gaps for refugee women and girls, because we immediately noticed that the profile of the refugees coming in was largely women and girls. And of course, the other more vulnerable groups of people, like the elderly, we had Roma communities. So it was important to get to understand what were the exact needs and risks that these group of people actually faced, refugees. So that was a top priority. Secondly, I wanted to identify what were the national GBV response services on the ground. Yeah, so that meant getting to understand what is available and how will access to these services being made to those coming in, and getting to map the specialized services even within, the framework of response. So that was a top priority for us as well. And thirdly, I wanted to identify the GBV safety and security risks for mitigation, because immediately we landed here, we'd done a bit of just getting to understand the situation. We learned that there were a lot of volunteers coming in, and people were going in and then moving into the country, and others also moving further on. So wanted to understand better how safe would we need to keep the populations in terms of maybe providing information so that they can know where to go to, making sure that the transport that was being provided to them was safe, and just like some of these basic kind of information that we need to make available to ensure that we mitigate the safety and security risks, particularly for women and girls. So those are the top three for me. And you know what? I found that they remain the same. They didn't change much because the situation was still quite, I would say, needed a lot of urgent attention to these three areas because there was very little that was happening in there. So it continued the same way. Even by the time I was leaving my deployment and handing over to my colleagues, I think it continues to be top priority for that operation.
Yes, thanks. And some of these things you're talking about with volunteers, with transportation, these details are key to the work that needs to be done. So I like that you talked about mapping and also those links with GBV risk mitigation, needing to first know where services are in case somebody does disclose. So this is something that makes a lot of sense for us here. Can you tell us about some of the GBV risks faced by Ukrainian women fleeing from the conflict and initial actions to mitigate those risks taken by you and those you were coordinating with in Slovakia?
I would say one of the huge risks, as is in many situations, is that in Slovakia, GBV remains very invisible. It's a highly patriarchal community, and there was very little data available. So basically, you're going into a situation where even as you're discussing about these things, there was still very little information available, or the community was not ready to speak about these issues, including, of course, looking at the national response capacities on the ground. So that was a big risk for us, as clearly seen. And then, of course, with the mass movements of people coming in large numbers, there were the initial concerns, as I mentioned, in the transit and reception facilities in terms of what were the transport arrangements being made. The government came in and stepped in very quickly, and people were coming in to volunteer the services and provide transport services to support the government. But then we realized within that there were those who were taking advantage of the situation. We'd find that some volunteers came from as far as up as Germany and the UK to volunteer themselves, but they had not even been screened. They were not even aware of some of these, like things that we should be watching out for when you're talking about getting young girls to go into vehicles to take them to places that probably they are unknown to them. So these initial arrangements were quickly, I think, sorted out with the authorities once they identified them, and including, of course, also the accommodation facilities that were being provided by the private arrangements of people who were offering up their homes. So these were some of the red flags that we saw. And then, of course, you're looking at a profile. You're talking about single women with young kids. You're talking about young girls, a lot of them pretty young girls, just coming in all alone. You're talking about the elderly. You're talking about those with diverse sexual orientation that are already, having challenges that's just getting through into Slovakia. So there were already certain risks identified with this group of people, such as sexual exploitation and abuse, trafficking, human trafficking. So they continue to be, like the highlight of the risks that we identified that we needed to start working on very quickly. And maybe also just to mention that the capacity of the national response systems, maybe given the scale of emergency, the types of violence that we're currently seeing, they were not very prepared to be able to handle and respond to this. So there was need to be able to understand within the limited services available, what can we do to help strengthen the national response? Then, of course, language. Language is such a big barrier, you would
Yes.
imagine. Yeah, so I mean, you'd find that there was very huge gaps in terms of communication, and this throughout, I think, the whole process was a big thing. You're talking about refugees who could only speak Ukrainian and some Russian, but a lot would not want to maybe also speak Russian for their own personal reasons. And you find the receiving communities not being able to speak their language. So lots of work to be done there. And finally, as you would imagine, you're talking about broken community and family support structures, given that, the laws that are in place in the country of origin was that young men between the ages of 18 and 60 had to remain behind. So you're talking about, families being split because they had to come. And of course, this further increased their vulnerabilities and brought in changes in family power dynamics, both within and outside the home. So you're talking about all these risks that were identified. And you talked a bit about what we did to be able to respond to these needs. So some of the quick things that, of course, we did was try to improve GBV information availability and also get to make this information available to as diverse places as possible, because we noticed that after they came in, they didn't stay at the border points, they went into the country. And when they went in, I think the challenge was that it was very difficult to identify where they had gone into. Some said that they were going to cross over into the neighboring countries again, because maybe they felt that Slovakia might not be able to meet their needs. So that continued to be a huge challenge. And I think it's one of the things that the government is grappling with. So GBV information, making it as much available as possible. And when I'm talking
And also,
about
as you said before, too, the language issues, right, with that
exactly.
information that's being disseminated. There was a lot of work that went into
Oh,
translations of
yeah.
materials
Oh, yeah. A
from the
big
beginning.
chunk of
Yes.
our work. Oh, yeah. You're so right. A big chunk of our work was with translations. And then, of course, working close with the Ministry of Labor and Social Services and Family, where they had tried to identify, some persons who would be able to work in the, like the hotlines. But again, still a lot had to be done to be able to bring it up to, the level at which you can be saying that we've comfortably been able to provide adequate information. I also talked about making sure that we had to build the capacity of the national actors and all those who are coming forward now to provide assistance. So it's one of the first things that we did, as you may have heard. So at the border points, we said, okay, fine, let's identify the border police and all those who are working there, the firemen, and give them some training on just some basic tools on how do you respond when somebody comes to you with a disclosure or GBV. What should you do, and where are the services? Let's work on making sure that we have focal points and we can be able to refer them. So the initial capacity building work that we did was practical, basic, I think, tools that we felt was important to equip these national responders and the other volunteers who had been identified. So some of the quick things that we did, I would say, would focus around that.
And, that makes a lot of sense, what you're talking about here. We've heard from the beginning of this conversation your mention of the word capacity and building that capacity and identifying who seems to be critical, the border patrol, also those volunteers that are in the transit center, the reception centers. Are there chances there? And the other areas, too, that you were working on, you needed a lot of coordination with people in Slovakia, too. They needed the translation as much as the Ukrainians did, too, if you were the key focal point. I think we can move to also talking about key challenges that you faced. What were some of those challenges, and how did you overcome them? And I know that might be a hard thing to tackle. You might have a long list, but maybe some key ones.
You highlighted one important thing, and that continued to be a huge challenge, surprisingly, coordination. And we keep saying, if you want to get your GBV work done, be it risk mitigation, be it prevention or response, you got to be able to coordinate within the different players that are in place. And That was one big challenge that we had in Slovakia. And why do I say so? It was quite limited because we did not have any structures in place so as to be able to coordinate the GBV response services impacting the quality, safe access and care for survivors. I guess because GBV, again, as I mentioned to you, in Slovakia was not a topic that was something that they really discussed. Yeah. GBV for most was related to intimate partner violence. As you're aware, Slovakia is not even a signatory, did not ratify the EU convention on what they call the Istanbul Convention, which looks at the discrimination and elimination of violence against women. So coordinating also between the different actors who had come in. Initially, of course, we talked about the volunteers, we talked about some of the civil society actors who had come in place, the formal ones, and of course the different government departments that were involved in the whole the whole response. You're talking about the transport, those working in the transport ministry. You're talking about Ministry of Health. We're talking about, of course, the social services. So trying to make sure that we bring them all to one table was not a very easy task in the beginning. And also, we were not able to get our own coordination structure where we could be able to focus specifically on GBV. In many places that we have worked in, and also I think particularly in this response, we had some of the operations, some of the country operations like Poland and Moldova were very, I would say, lucky in the sense that we're able to have their own specific coordination structure established. So you got all the partners together. You can sit down and discuss about the issues affecting your response. You can highlight issues. You can, delegate responsibilities and roles within different actors. It was not very easy for us there. But one of the things we did was that we made sure, even within the protection working group, we had GBV had one standing agenda item. So we'd make sure that we have some time to discuss issues that we highlighted as a key concern. Like, for instance, issues around accommodation. As I said, it was a big thing. Yeah. So we talked about the risks that we had noticed that these women and girls would face. I mean, if the government did not step up to make sure that, one, we mapped all these accommodation centers, particularly those that were not run by the government, and made sure that they understood that those who are providing these services have been vetted, they're aware of the consequences in case of anything, and also provide information to those who are actually being sheltered here. So we tried to work on accommodation and on coordination. And I want to just emphasize that because I think it was one of the big things that impacted on all the other challenges that we had. Like if you're talking about limited information, if you don't get people together to agree on the messaging, well, it's not very easy, as you would naturally expect in a situation where you already have a coordination structure and you can easily come up together with messaging where you've been able to delegate within different people working within the response to reach out to the communities, to highlight the messaging and that sort of thing. So I think that is one challenge that I would like to highlight.
Yes, and before you go on to another one, can I just ask you already about a suggestion there or any advice that you would give someone to address that challenge related to coordination? I heard what you said about an alternative coordination structure within the protection working group. So you were able to at least have that standing agenda item. Are there any other suggestions or advice you might give related to that?
I think one of the other things I feel like almost very practical that we do in many other places is making sure that you familiarize yourselves with all the different actors and bring them together in whatever forum to discuss some of these specific issues. So we'd have like very focus-based kind of discussions on certain issues. Once you have built together that network of key players together as a way of sort of trying to make sure that, you get common messaging and everybody is aware of what's going on, especially the relevant stakeholders. So I feel like that's quite an important role that we need to play in terms of being able to find alternative ways of coordination. And then also, I think a lot of it is just reaching out to also the communities themselves, because I felt it's much more powerful when you get to the voices of the refugees, the women and the girls, saying that they feel that there are these needs. And once we take them even to the government level, then they see and realize that, I mean, who would fight against that, you know? So trying to make sure that we also get those voices to this table where we're all sitting, I think is also quite key, and making sure that this information is made available to as many people as possible, particularly the relevant people. So yeah, I think
Yes, those
those couple of
voices
things.
strengthen the
Yeah.
message. Yes,
Yes.
the message you're
Yeah.
trying to carry. Did you want to highlight another challenge?
Maybe, as I said before, where we were not able to get a lot of information about where the refugees had gone to. So it was very difficult to know how we can focus our outreach work. And I think by the time we're leaving there, that was one of the key things that we said we're going to focus on now. Yeah, really strengthen our outreach, try to identify these local places where we had that there could be refugees who would, sort of gathered around there and more comfortable working the communities, identifying who are the voices, leading voices within the refugees to bring them together. So I think, that was also, I think, one of the things that we identify immediately as a challenge that we try to address as soon as possible. Yeah, and then I guess also because it was in the initial stages, it was also very difficult, as expected, to get people coming forward to talk about the issues. And then you find everyone was very interested in getting stats and getting information and wanting to know. So what are the type? I mean, like, listen, please, hold on. For us, I think our priority is not to share with you numbers and details, but to make sure that we have the available services, to make sure that this information is shared as widely as possible to the refugee women and girls and others that will require this information. As we build up, the systems and structures, and make sure that we share, with them the standards and guidelines in terms of how you respond in such emergencies. So we also had that, I think, because there was a lot of interest in getting to know, so what's the scale, what numbers? Yeah, we hear that, that there might be cases of trafficking, but do you know the numbers? Has anybody reported? So we try to make everyone understand that our priorities need to be focused this way. And sometimes it can detract you from attention from focusing on what the real actual needs are.
Yes, and when you are thinking about also just advice you can give to other staff responding to an emergency, especially those working on GBV, can you comment on localization and involvement of women-led organizations in your coordination work? You already started talking about raising women's voices. And in particular, women-led organizations. There was a big volunteer response, and there are coordination groups in other operations that had talked about the presence of NGOs or community-based organizations. But what did you see in Slovakia related to women-led organizations and that local response?
You know what? I think what really helped us most in the end were these local women's organizations, the local actors and the refugees themselves. I think this is where our strength was. And we need to remember that every time we're doing this work, that they're the ones who understand the real needs. And we need to find a way of making sure that we bring them closer so that they are actually the first responders in such situations. So once we're able to start seeking out these local women's groups, the local civil society organizations, women-led, they told us a lot of things. They guided us on how we needed to go in trying to address GBV, in particular in Slovakia. They highlighted some of the challenges that they faced as women of Slovakia, that they felt that, if we could actually work together and support, this would also help refugee women. So they, I must say, were the most useful, I think, constituency we had in terms of our response. And of course, now with the refugees themselves, the women and girls, getting them involved, they were telling us what their issues are. They were telling us, listen, you need to focus more on getting this language issue resolved, because we need to be able to communicate. And once we can communicate, we'll not be able to realize some of our needs and rights are achieved. So we had to shift our attention based on some of the things they would highlight to us. They would tell us, listen, we know that there are all these free services offered by the government. They're saying that there's free transport, but we don't know for how long, that they're going to provide childcare facilities. But we understand that there's some gaps and risks around there. So then we would raise these issues and they would come up for discussion. So we realized the minute we got more and more involved with the local actors, the local responders, and the refugee women and girls themselves, we were able to get better traction. And I think also more positively, we're able to see good results.
Well, thank you so much, June. And this has been an enlightening conversation. And I think as a last question, I'd just like to ask, what are some resources that you would recommend to other staff working to address GBV that you find useful for GBV risk mitigation in emergencies?
I would say one of the tools that really worked for us was the pocket guide, the how to support survivors with GBV when you don't have a GBV act in place, because that was a situation we found ourselves in. So we tried to make sure that we disseminate as much as possible, try to get it translated. We're still working on it. So one of the key, I think, tools that really worked well for us was that. And then, of course, the interagency standing guidelines, GBV guidelines, was also quite useful. Coordination. The documents also provide on GBV coordination, also by the Interagency Standing Committee. That was also quite useful. And of course, the UNHCR safety audit tool, quite handy. Because I didn't mention, but one of the things that really worked on was trying to do like this safety audit, I would say risk mitigation, just doing an assessment of the shelter facilities. And you know what? The tool that you developed for us was really useful, because we used that to quickly go in and help us in guiding us in our assessments. And we did that in about 9-10 locations. And we were able to bring this out in the discussions when we're looking at accommodation facilities. And it really worked well. So,
and glad to know that was useful. That was thanks for that feedback. That was the GBV checklist for reception centers.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Really, really useful.
Well, thank you, June, for taking the time to share your experiences with us on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation during an emergency, and for recommending some resources in the area of GBV.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure talking about my experience in Slovakia.
Thank you for joining us. And to all of our listeners, do tune in to the next podcast in our series from the GLDC on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings.